You know, if this were based on a Joel Schumacher-directed Batman film, the logo would spin a little faster, would shoot out neon lights, and would probably have bat nipples. But I'm digressing here. So here we are, Batman for the Sega Genesis, released in 1991 by Sunsoft and based on the 1989 Tim Burton directed motion picture of the same name. No doubt some of you folks are aware, or at least familiar with, the Batman video game that was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System that same year, which did take a few liberties with the source material, but otherwise turned out to be one of the finest games to grace the console, and one of a select few licensed video games that actually didn't suck. Meanwhile, the Genesis version went in a different direction from its 8-bit rival, which in hindsight is probably a good thing considering the other time Sunsoft tried to craft a Genesis version of an NES game featuring Batman. While the NES iteration of Batman loosely followed the plot of the first film and took several liberties to create one of the finest games on the console, the Genesis version aims for a game that more closely follows the film narrative. This means less emphasis on embellishments and loose interpretations to make for a more exciting video game, and more emphasis on accurately recreating the world and narrative of the movie it's based upon. No high-tech gimmicks or superpowered henchmen to be found here, you're just facing off against the Joker's very ordinary henchmen led by Bob. The end result is a game that feels a little slower paced, and may be perceived as a somewhat lesser experience for some, but still very much a worthwhile experience in its own right. Batman is a side-scrolling action game where you take control of Batman, obviously, and you go through numerous levels and beat the crap out of enemies or something. Because Batman. Batman can punch and kick, and he can also jump, which is useful for reaching higher platforms. You have no wall jump, but you do have a grappling hook that can be used to propel you to higher places, as well as a spinning jump that can be used to cross wider gaps. A spinning jump that requires you to press the jump button twice to execute. I hate to refer to the other version constantly, but that version had a much more reliable and less fussy jump that could cross wider gaps with a single button press. It's called the Batman jump. You have a limited number of batarangs, which you can always collect more of, but no other weapons of note. Oh, you can block against bullets as well, but not against fists. Yeah, thanks. When you start a new game, you only start with 4 hit points out of a possible 8, and some enemies could easily subdue you in a couple of hits rather quickly, resulting in lives being exhausted at a frightening rate. You can't collect health pickups to replenish your hit points, but these are fairly uncommon. The game does allow you to choose your starting lives count at 3, 5, or 7 lives, but you will always have a limited number of continues. There's also a skill select allowing you to play the game on normal or hard difficulty, but quite frankly this game is hard enough on normal as it is. Part of it has to do with the occasional bits of cheapness abounding. Look, the exploding pipes is one thing, just a bit of timing and memorization. But then there's instances of Batman jumping towards a platform that's barely visible on the edge of the screen, but because the screen didn't feel like scrolling fast enough, the Dark Knight just falls to his doom. This happened more often than I care to witness. The constant respawning of enemies and their inconvenient positioning makes things a little irritable, especially when it comes to navigating levels with lots of platforming and the constant threat of a stray hit throwing your hapless Dark Knight into the abyss below, a common video game problem that haunts many players in a variety of titles. And yet for all the nags and quirks that I brought up, none of that really killed the game. Batman has a tendency to be cheap, yes, but whenever it decides against going that particular route, Batman is rather playable. When it comes to control, it's responsive, solid, and functional, the only real issue being trying to pull off that double jump at the right time. But that comes with practice and or a stroke of luck. Not to mention the ability to give yourself more lives from the start. The rather flexible respawning after dying bit makes life a bit easier. It's no cakewalk, but once you get the hang of things, Batman can be conquered. A bonus feature that the Genesis version of Batman possesses over the NES game is the ability to control the Batmobile as well as the Batwing in a couple shoot-'em-up style levels. Despite the fact that both are completely different vehicles, both play pretty much the same way, with B allowing you to shoot your regular guns while A button launches your homing missiles, of which you have a limited amount. It's not too bad all things considered, gets a bit hectic at times, but it's a nice little break from the side-scrolling stuff. However, because there's only 2 levels in this format, they have a tendency to overstay their welcome as these levels are a little too long for their own good, especially considering the scenes they are adapting have a much shorter runtime in comparison. Given that this Batman video game aims to follow the movie much more closely than the NES iteration, the visuals manage to nail the look and atmosphere of the movie almost perfectly, whether it be the gothic look of the Gotham City streets or the beige-looking Fuggelheim Museum. Batman himself looks well-defined and closely matches the way he looked in the movie, right down to the suit being black rather than a darkish blue tint thing. His walking animation's kinda odd though. For all the game's attempts at trying to capture the look and feel of the film, and Batman does accomplish these with its level designs, but it also suffers from the classic syndrome of overloading on the earth tones. Browns and beiges and light browns and dark browns and browns and beiges and, that stuff. I don't remember there being that many earth tones in the movie. Oh well. The overall visuals look pretty good, all things considered, right down to the various digitized cutscenes. In regards to sound, it's alright. The game's soundtrack bears no traces of the Danny Elfman composed film score, opting for completely original music instead, although the game does cheat a bit by swiping a couple NES tunes and remixing them somewhat, one of them being the boss tune, so there you go. The rest of the soundtrack sounds like top-notch chip music, not something quickly and cheaply tossed together, but the tunes themselves are not quite top-notch. If nothing else, they're well composed, they fit the mood and tone of the game. There's a couple standout tracks in the game, it's just merely good chip music with a couple great tunes in there. The sound effects are weak. Punches and kicks sound like air puffs, gunfire sounds weak. Yeah, not impressed with the sound, but that merely means more of the soundtrack is heard, so I guess that's fine. Batman for the Sega Genesis is a faithful adaptation of the motion picture it aims to adapt, and manages to turn it into a pretty solid side-scroller, albeit one with some quibbles. The gameplay doesn't feel as polished, there are moments where the difficulty dwells within the realm of the cheapness, the vehicle segments drag on long past the point of intolerance. But despite all that, it's still a fairly well-made little game that does a fine job of keeping to the film it's based on, both in terms of the narrative and in terms of the visual style. Even with all the quirks and nagging points, Batman delivers the goods on the Mega Drive and is worth checking out if you want a solid adaptation of a classic comic book movie.